It's very nice to see old friends, to see David here, who was kind of one of the people that encouraged me to work on these issues of Pentecostalism. So let us see here. Now I have just a little. Now I'm back on the stage. And it was actually the first time I started thinking about this issue was when I actually was in a conference. I think we were in Uppsala together with Paul Gifford in the early 2000s. I had just started my working on my PhD on Norwegian missionaries. But as I will tell you later on now, I really started to see some changes going on. So even before I was halfway in my PhD, I really knew what my postdoctoral studies would be about, because what was really changing Christianity at that time for me was what we're going to talk about today, Pentecostalism in Cameroon. And I had some very good role models, both in Paul Gifford at SOAS and David here now in Cambridge. So it's very nice to be back here and be able to do this. But first, I would like to draw attention to something that you have done recently, because I think that that your book on the Pentecostal world was really was a joy to read it, actually. And I think that what I will try to share with you today is one or a few images from the Pentecostal world. And you write in your introduction that the flamboyant and politically influential churches attract much attention, while a much larger underbelly of ordinary Pentecostal, which allows the fringes to resonate, remains under-examined by comparison. And as you said, I would try to share with you some of this underbelly of ordinary Pentecostals from Cameroon. And as I was looking at the introduction once more before coming here, and thinking about what I've experienced these last 4 months, I've been traveling actually through Africa, started in Ethiopia, went to Cameroon, then to Madagascar, and then to South Africa. I realized that I could have done a lot of things today. I could have talked about how Pentecostalization is happening in one of the largest Lutheran churches in Ethiopia, how the Mekane Yesu church now is changing. It's very hard to say, is this a Lutheran church or a Pentecostal church? And you touch upon these issues. I could have given a talk on the deliverance movement among Lutherans in Madagascar, starting in the 1890s, long before the Azusa Streets. And that was actually a movement where they developed a theology of deliverance that is very much similar to what is going on in mainline Pentecostal or neo-Pentecostal churches today. So there are so many aspects, or of course we could end up by talking about the pure madness that you refer to as well, of Pentecostal prophets in South Africa, which are really outrageous. There is so much going on. So this complexity of what's going on in the Pentecostal world, you can pick so many interesting aspects, but what I will do is, of course, to talk to you about what I know the best, which is Cameroon. And I will try to say something about another field that is a bit understudied, is the Pentecostal relation to Islam. There are some studies, and you have a chapter from Hans Olsson in Zanzibar in your book, but I think that a lot of these very big actors are living and working in areas very close to Muslims, but it's not very much up in, or haven't been very much up in the talk about what's going on. So that's what I will try to do. Say something about the developments between Pentecostals and Muslims in Cameroon, very much influenced by the waves of migration that are kind of really happening in Cameroon right now. But the background is that for very many years, we've talked about Cameroon as an island of peace in a very disturbed area, in the sense that in Nigeria, you had a lot of conflicts between Christian and Muslims. Chad, Central African Republic. These are not very stable states. There's been a lot of civil wars going on in the area, but Cameroon has somehow managed to keep good relations compared to the neighboring countries. And then, of course, the question is, with the rise of Pentecostalism, with the radical Muslim terrorism, due to the Boko Haram attacks in the north, and increased migration, is this a threat towards these peaceful Christian-Muslim relations? That's what I will try to give a partial answer to this afternoon. And of course, the question is, do we see the changed Pentecostal public religion in light of migration and Muslim terrorism in the far north? And here you can see the map of Cameroon, and Maroua is in a little bit north of the middle. That's the area where I have worked. And you have the northern region and the far north, or extreme north, that we say in French. And that is really the area where you have all the Boko Haram attacks. And you have a lot of different things that makes this a very difficult place to live right now, and I will come back to that. As Björn said, I've had the opportunity to follow this from kind of more of a longitude thing. The good thing about getting older is that you actually get more experience in the sense that you can see some developments yourself. Yeah. And from my first visit in Cameroon in 1996, I moved there in 1998 for the first time, and stayed there until more or less until 2009, a bit back and forth during those years. But we really have seen a big change in the Christian demographic situation since 1996. It was first in 2008 I really had the time to do fieldwork among the Pentecostal churches. 2008, 2009, I published a book, Pentecostalism, Globalization and Islam in Northern Cameroon, in 2013. Since then, I have, of course, been in contact with the field, but unable to do any serious fieldwork until this or last year. So in December and January, I had the privilege to be back, and it was very interesting to go back and see the same congregations, some of the same pastors, and see what had happened in these kind of 10, 15 years since I was there last time. And I will give you some examples of what has been going on. But I have been actually able to see Pentecostalism going from a sect, because that's really what everybody said in 1996. We only talked about the sects, and to become a real established religion. And now it has become the establishment, and they're invited to government happenings and maybe bigger Muslim events, etc., which was never the case before. So in these years, we have really seen how Pentecostalism has become part of the establishment. I mean, I'm able to publish a few things on the what should we say, more economic development side, both in terms of prosperity and development work and migration, etc., etc. But being quite deep down in administrative business, it hasn't been too much time to publish, and I really hope that now I will have the opportunity to do something more. And I would just say that the subtitle of my book was Mega Churches in the Making, with a question. And of course, a lot of people ask me about this. I mean, there are no mega churches in Northern Cameroon. I just looked into the handbook of mega churches, and okay, you have to have a minimum of 2,000 people to call it a mega church. But the point is that when you went around to these churches, like Église de la Foi Vivante, that had this vision, for instance, to build a missionary mega church where the word of faith, healing, miracles will transform people. Those are kind of the visions from the very beginning of these churches. And the mission is to bring love to this world in pain and deliver it from the satanic oppressions through kind of through the faith and the word of faith. So you see that these are very kind of basic Pentecostal visions that have been imported from the neo-Pentecostal churches in Nigeria, etc., even if it is in a very different context. And we shall see if some of these things have come true during the years. But first of all, a few words about the peaceful historical relations. And I think that that we could say that Islam, for the very first time, entered this area around 1830, when you had this Muslim Fulbe invasion coming from the northern part of Nigeria. So we had what they call the Sokoto Caliphate, that was very strong in Nigeria, that expanded in this period into Cameroon. And of course, it was a military expansion, so it wasn't peaceful at that time, but they were so dominant military that it wasn't much of a fight, so to speak. They very easily took over control of the area, because the demography of Cameroon is there's a lot of ethnic groups. I think we have more like close to 280 recognized ethnic groups in a relatively small country. So we had a lot of small ethnic groups, and they all have languages that are very, very different. So there were not very much collaboration between them. So that's why it was quite easy for the Muslim Ummah to gain political control over the area. And this is only like 20, 30 years before the first Christian missionaries entered the shores of Cameroon in the south. But there were no Christian missionaries. What happened was that the Fulbe, the Muslim Fulbe, they were so dominant that what they called the Kirdi population, they just called all the others Kirdi, like heathens, they became vassals. And why was the Islamization process very slow? Because the wealth of the Fulbe was based on two things. It was the cattle and it was slaves. And they couldn't enslave the other people if they were Muslims. So it was better for the Fulbe to keep these other ethnic groups, so to speak, in the dark, because then you could make slaves of them. And a lot of slaves were exported to the slave markets in Nigeria as late as the late 1890s and the beginning of the 1900s. It wasn't until the Germans arrived in this area around 1900 that slavery actually ended. And there are European reports that more than 10,000 slaves were exported and sold in Nigeria from this area alone in this period. So it was quite a big business. That's why the Islamization process was slow. They kept Islam to themselves for a very long time, until actually the missionaries arrived. And in this area, the first missionaries were the Americans. A few Americans arrived in 1923, and then a Norwegian in 1925. And that is when Christianity really started to grow in this area. And what happened was that when the Muslims saw the work of the Christian missionaries through the schools, through the health centers, etc., they realized that the Kirdi population was about to slip away. They were no longer allowed to have slaves, and they were losing hold of kind of these communities. And what happened then was actually that they started then sharing the Muslim religion also with what they priorly called the heathen ethnic groups that lived in this area. So in that sense, we have kind of course, a competition like we see all over in Africa between the Christian missionaries and what is to become the Muslim missionaries and so on. And slowly, in about 100 years, the religious demographics of this area has completely changed. And I think that I haven't done this, of course, but if you go around and ask people, probably 90% would say that they are either Christians and Muslims. And of course, you have this mixture of the traditional religion, etc., etc. And this is also a big question. When it comes to the growth of Pentecostalism, is it also because they have managed to kind of incorporate more of the traditional ideas, etc., etc.? But let's move on to say a few words about what happened when Pentecostalism arrived. And what actually drew me to these studies is what you see on the screen now. I traveled quite a lot around northern Cameroon when I was living there. I was teaching at a theological seminar, but also teaching a little bit in Bible schools all over the area. So what I realized that as we traveled around, more and more signs were popping up. And in the beginning, I didn't understand what this was, because I wasn't very much into Pentecostalism, and at least not in this part of Africa. But then we saw that the Assemblée de Dieu Pentecôtistes, the Deeper Life Bible Church, Mission de Plein Évangile, Église de la Parole Vivante, etc. They did pop up all over the places. So I was asking myself, what is actually going on here? Because this is not going on with any missionaries, with any contacts with the West or anything else. So that was kind of the first questions I asked myself. And then when I started to read Paul Gifford and then David Maxwell stuff, I realized that this is actually what is going on all over Africa. And this is actually the new thing going on that is changing the landscape, so to speak. In your chapter, there's a lot of talk about what is the local context that makes things happen the way it happens. And I would say that in Cameroon, it is very much related to the politics of the country, and also the politics actually of the colonial administration. Why? Because the French political administration had a very strong hand on the religious groups in the area, both the Muslims and the Christians. Why? Because they saw that what was going on in Northern Africa was that extreme Muslim groups were growing up, starting to create problems for the French. So as a consequence of that, they had a very strict policy on religious organizations all over Western Africa. So when I did archival studies for my PhD, I also found a lot, because then I was looking for things about the relationship between the colonial administration and Norwegian missionaries. I also found a lot of interesting stuff on the correspondence between the colonial administration and Muslim organizations. And they actually discussed in detail what kind of literature they were allowed to import to the country. Because the colonial administration did their best to stop extremist things from entering the country, and they actually promoted a Sufi Islam through the Tijaniya Brotherhood. They actually sponsored Tijaniya Sufi leaders from North Africa coming to Cameroon, received as dignitaries, driven around all the country by the vehicles of the colonial administration in order to promote Sufism as a peaceful version of Islam. So we see that it was very strict, and it was very hard to get to be allowed to send missionaries, for instance. We saw that when the Norwegian missionaries wanted to send new missionaries, there were correspondence back and forth, Paris, Norway, and then back to Cameroon, and then it was sent messages to all over colonial Africa asking, are these Norwegian troublemakers or whatever. So I tried to follow one of those correspondents. I think I collected like 50 letters or something, going back and forth all over Europe and Africa in order to accept 9 visas for Norwegian missionaries. So it really means that the French did all they could to prevent things from happening outside of their eyes, so to speak. This policy was continued by the 2 first presidents in Cameroon. We've only had 2 actually, because Paul Biya, who entered the stage in 1982, he's still in power. So Ahidjo first, and then Paul Biya afterwards, and they continued this very strong hand on religious organizations. But what happened in the 1990s was actually that the World Bank put a lot of pressure on African countries in order to democratize, which meant that in order to have loan from the World Bank, they had to open up a civil society organization, and that affected also religious organizations. So it became much easier to start a new congregation after the 1990s. And this, combined with increased internal migrations, a lot of Pentecostalism entered Cameroon from Nigeria through the south, and slowly it moved north. I interviewed one of the pioneers who said of one of the churches, he was actually a taxi driver from the south. He came to Ngaoundéré, his taxi broke down. And then he said, I had this vision from God saying that the reason why the taxi broke down is because you're going to start a church here, of course. And this is a very Pentecostal way to explain why they ended up here for this or that reason, but that was the taxi driver. So he was one of these 25 churches that I found when I was there. In addition, of course, globalization, as much discussed, has changed a lot. And of course, technology has changed a lot because things fly and things move at a different pace. And I will say a few words about that. Because when I wrote up the conclusion of my book in 2013, why did the Pentecostal church succeed? I realized that in 1996, I think there were like 3 Pentecostal churches in Ngaoundéré. That was a city then of like 200,000 people maybe. Now there's close to 800,000 again. So it's not that big, but it's a mid-sized African town. In 2008, we went around with my research assistant, actually counted all the churches we found, and I think we managed to map like 25 different Pentecostal denominations. Some of them had more churches, but most of them are very small churches. Like it could be between 20, 30, and up to 100, maybe 200, not more than that at that time. If we should say, take a guess now, maybe there are between 30 and 40. I didn't count this time, but you see like Redeemed, Winners Chapel, all these big churches that went there, they are now established. So you see more and more churches coming in. And how did I try to analyze this globalization movement? Ruth Marshall, in a study from Nigeria in 2009, talked about the flow of images and ideas. And Geschire, Meyer, and Van Winsberger earlier on in 98 talked about the flow, fix, and virtuality. And I must admit that I'm very often fascinated by these new buzzwords. And of course, globalization caught my eye. And I thought this is a very interesting approach. But then as a researcher, can you really find traces of these buzzwords on the field, so to speak? And I must say that to some extent I did, and I will give you just one example. Because when I arrived and started talking to people in the area, most Pentecostals talked a lot about crusades. That was the big thing. We are a religion of crusades. And then I started looking around. I didn't see any crusades in the area, and I was there for quite a long time. And then I asked people, yeah, have you been part of any big crusade? No, but they knew someone, and they knew a pastor who had done that. And there were 1 or 2 crusades in the area a few years back. But for instance, Iya Musa, which is the pastor of one of the congregations that I followed, he did his doctorate in Germany, and that was in the 1990s. And he was part of the Pentecostal church that did his crusade to Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall. So I think he went to Czechia or somewhere in the Czech Republic or somewhere. So he came back with these images and he talked about these crusades. So when I tried to adapt kind of the flow, fix, and virtuality idea, I realized that, yes, the flow part is actually the fact that people talk about others who have been part of this. I know this and this guy who took part in this, and my friend was converted in a big thing going on down in the south, etc., etc. But what do you do yourself? We go from door to door with the pamphlets. We have the flyers, we stand on the corners, and that is our crusade. So the fixed part of this flow, fix, and virtuality is the fact that they are doing something that is fixed, it's very concrete, but it's part of the big flow of these big crusades. And then the virtuality thing is that through this, going from door to door, They are part of a global imagination that we as Pentecostals, we do crusades, even if I do my little part here. So in that sense, I think it's also possible sometimes to actually adapt these buzzwords to the field and say that they actually do give meaning in some sense. And with a lot of examples like this, I ended up to say that, well, to some extent, global mobility, local flexibility of adapting these big ideas, together with spiritual authority and human dignity was kind of the four main things that stood out as the things that made the churches grow in my findings. So this question then, this Pentecostal growth, is it a myth or is it a fact? Well, first of all, I think that we often forget when we talk about Africa that the demographic changes are enormous. In Cameroon, the population has doubled from 2000 to 2020. It means that we have gone from 50 million to 30 million. It means that any church should double in size without growing, if you understand what I mean. So it means that the Lutheran Church, which I know very well, is a very good example. They operated with a number of 350,000 members in 2000, and now they say that we are about 700,000. It means that, well, they have doubled in size and they can boast about that, but actually what has happened is that just kind of been able to adapt to the changing demographic situation. And I think that all this talk about growth among Pentecostals also has to be seen into that bigger picture. But then again, when I came back now in 2023, 24, what had happened? Well, Église de la Foi Vivante, which there is a picture of here to the right, really had changed. When I was there the first time, it was a very small congregation with like 60, 80 people coming in a small church. But Ian Musa now has built a very nice church. I think he has bought more or less the whole quarter where he's living. He has a health center. He has schools from kindergarten until high school. Actually, even if it's not very big, it is growing. So he's an example, and you see that the church now is about to have this kind of Pentecostal look, and it's the speakers are bigger and the colors are brighter and everything. So compared to the Lutheran Church, you actually see that this is an example that something has happened, and he's not alone. And the other example I will talk about today is the Full Gospel Mission that had only one church in town in 2008. Now they actually have 5. And in the neighboring Meganga city where I lived before, they went from 0 to 5 churches or congregations within these years, these 15 years. So we actually see that the Pentecostal churches that I talk to now, some of them have probably disappeared. I didn't visit all of them, but the main ones that I knew then, they actually have experienced some of this growth. So what has actually happened? I think that what has happened is that in addition to the population growth, there is the big issue of migration going on, and the big issue of urbanization. The fact that Pentecostalism, even if we see more and more establishments on the countryside, this is still an urban phenomenon. It's going on in the big cities, and that is where the churches are growing. And we see in Cameroon a very strong movement from the villages to the cities all over. So Ngaoundéré, which is the city I've done much of my field work, has more than doubled in size, maybe triple in size in these 20 years, showing that it's much more than just the population growth because people are moving into this. But what are this migration that is going on? We are going back to that and see how the Pentecostal churches are adapting to the new situation after having looked a little bit on the Islamic developments that has gone on in the area. Here we have 3 pictures that kind of shows the development that has been going on. First, how kind of the French colonial administration welcomed the Fulani king, the Lamido of Ngaoundéré. He is here sitting together in one of the first cars that arrived, French cars that arrived in the area. But then we have had different movements. I told you before that, first of all, we had a colonial support for the Muslim brotherhoods, like the Tijaniya, which is the biggest Sufi order in the area. So that was kind of what we call traditional Islam, an Islam that accepted a lot of traditional elements. So in the Sufism of northern Cameroon, there will be a very nice mixture of the magic from the old days, so to speak, taken into this new Muslim and Islamic leaders. So traditional Islamic leaders will normally solve local disputes like they've done for like 200-300 years, where it was the village chief before, and now it's a Muslim chief, etc. And that's the way they have been working. During the Hindu government, something changed. Why? Because the Hindu wanted to open up for the rest of the world. A lot of contacts with Saudi Arabia, who has, for instance, built the University of Garoua. There were a lot of scholarships, and slowly, Wahhabism also entered into northern Cameroon. And now you see this kind of fight for hegemony between the traditional Fulbe and the more Arab-speaking young scholars coming from the Arab world, or from Nigeria and somewhere from Libya, Egypt, etc., etc. So that's kind of changing, because with the arrival of Wahhabism, you also have a slightly different approach towards Christian, the Christian community. Because whereas the Sufi movement is very liberal in that sense, Wahhabism has a much rougher approach towards other religions. And what really was the big game changer, of course, was the arrival of the Boko Haram movement from Nigeria. And it's been quite harsh also in Cameroon, even if we talk about it more or less as a Nigerian movement. For a while, it had a very strong headquarters in northern Cameroon. It doesn't have that anymore, but still we can talk. I will tell you more about what's going on these days, because the Boko Haram crisis really has affected the whole country. The first activity started back in 2009, just after I left, but it was maybe from 2012 that abduction of foreign citizens started, and local elites. And that's the way they started funding also their activities, by taking hostages and releasing them at enormous sums. There are some ideas or some talks about the amount of money, but it's kind of, we are moving towards billions of euros. It's incredible how big this business has been in Nigeria and Cameroon combined. Both local elites, but for a while it was most, of course, publicity when it was foreign. There was a French family, there was an Italian priests and some Chinese workers, etc. that was abducted, but released later on. So this led actually Paul Biya to declare the war on Boko Haram on 14th of May 2014, and that's when they really put in the military and started more or less like a civil war in the region, in the northern parts. But of course, to wage war on someone you don't even know who your enemy is, it is this borderland between Nigeria, Chad, and Central African Republic, makes it very, very difficult. And we've seen how Nigeria has failed in kind of eradicating the movement, even if it's much weaker than it was. In 2016, it was also the split between Boko Haram and what we call ISWAP. That was the fraction that connected to the Islamic State, ISIS, so Islamic States of West Africa. And later there have been even smaller groups. So the problem today is also that there are so many small fractions working. And there were various countermeasures, of course, the military, the Brigade d'Intervention Rapide, the BEAR, trained by the Americans, and Israeli army. They sent in like 2,000 soldiers, they gave a lot of weapons to vigilant groups. So they are actually encouraged the local population to fight themselves against Boko Haram. But since a large part of the economy in these border areas, I think up to 60–70%, is connected to trade across the borders, these vigilante groups also enter into this kind of the dark side of the economy. So it's become very, very complicated up there. The Americans, the French were involved, and today it's relatively calm, but not completely. We have border raids that continues also in 2024, and I got a very frightening reminder of this, because I was doing fieldwork in Ngaoundéré. One night I was together with one of my informants who was pastor of a newly established church. And he talked about his where his children were working, and he said, well, I actually got one of my boys working with a French NGO outside Maroua in the far north. And actually the day after he called me to say that his son was hijacked by one of these groups. And this happened early January. And it was actually 2 weeks ago that we got the message that he was released. So that's actually how they work. They spread terror through that, and to feel kind of this so close to my friend and an informant, it was cruel. I mean, just to follow the what he has been going through for this month. And that's kind of the question is, how can Christian-Muslim relations survive if this is the image of Islam that is spread? Fortunately, we see also a lot of Muslims engaging now, like we see in the picture underneath here, where you have Muslim women saying no to terrorism, yes to Islam, and there's a lot of movement among mainline Muslims, so to speak, both in Nigeria and Cameroon now, in order to try to talk about these as terrorists and not as Islamic terrorists. And I think that's more or less the picture that is been established now. A few words about migration in Cameroon. There is today, according to UN, 2.2 million forcibly displaced persons. 1.1 million are internally displaced, far from home. There are like 500,000 refugees coming from Nigeria and CAR. 450,000 persons have left their homes in the far north due to climate change on the one side and terrorism on the other side. The far north has been extremely densely populated, and with the explosion in the growth of population together with climate change, a lot of them have moved down to the Maroua area where I did my field work. So now we see actually that we have whole villages that are moving south, because in the Maroua region it's quite fertile and it's a lot of space with quite a few people. So more and more they are moving whole villages further south. Some of them are Christians, some of them are Muslims. And of course this creates tension between the locals and the migrants. And I'm working on a project right now also to see how the churches are able to negotiate in those kind of conflicts. But let us now, towards the end, just give you a few examples of what is going on the ground. How does, for instance, the Full Gospel Mission, which is probably the biggest Pentecostal church in Cameroon, with more than, I think it's more than 1,000 congregations all over the country. It was initiated by a German missionary in the early 1960s, but it very soon became a national church and has moved on. And they have a theological approach towards these migrants that I would call the guesthouse approach. When you see the posters, etc., there's a lot of, you can see it here on the picture, but there's a lot of focus on mission. We always want to start more congregations, meet new people, we pray for our missions abroad, etc., etc., etc. But the pastor that I interviewed, he actually saw it as a problem that most of the people coming to them were kind of people passing by. So even if they're growing a lot, they are having some problems connected to the locals. So he said that yes, that's it. It's like a guest house. Some come and at some point they leave and others come too. So that's the work we're redoing. Every time we do it and we do it again. Well, by the grace of God, we continue to preach so that the locals will believe and that they themselves take matters into their own hands. Because others come and they leave, so we need the locals. In order to run a guest house, you also need employees. You need people who are stable, etc., etc. So what missiologists would say is a big asset of this church, that it is able to attract newcomers. It's seen partly as a problem by them, because there is so much in and out of the churches, even if they grow a lot. And then I asked him, but what do you do about the migrants? And what if some of these migrants are Muslims? And he said, yes, this is the case. From the Central African Republic, there are a lot of Muslims coming. And then we can ask ourselves, what would be the normal approach of a Pentecostal church towards these Muslims? You could think power evangelization, you could think spiritual wars, etc., etc. But this is not the case at all. He says, well, it's true that we have that in our action plan. And since we have health centers, we tried, especially in Garoua, Ngaoundéré, we try to do what we call chaplaincy. So when these people come, the pastor who speaks well in Fulda or Hausa, we can take them aside. We try to talk to them and so on. And while we're doing that, those who believe, we follow them in peace, in secrecy, because if others find out, they will be threatened. We bless God because there is one of the Maroua who believe, who is even a pastor today. And there is also another Hausa, the pastor who is responsible of the chaplaincy. And there is also another one in a hospital in Garoua. What is going on here? I mean, Pentecostals who really think in terms of crusades, what do they do here? They act like kind of, what should we say, Catholics who do kind of an approach where you really do this in secrecy. It means that we almost talk about anonymous Christians here. And it shows the big changes that have gone around even among the Pentecostals. That they do their missionary outreach almost in secrecy, talking to people on another level. So we see the change. It's very hard to distinguish now Pentecostal missionaries from Catholic missionaries, from Lutheran missionaries, because of this. And these relationships, we see that they are very much influenced by the context. When we did fieldwork in 2009, in 50 services, no preaching against Islam. This approach was confirmed and strengthened in 2024. The pastor again said, no, but the relationship with Muslims, well, maybe at the beginning we could see them as enemies, or we could say that they don't understand. But we have changed the attitude towards them. These are the people that God has created. They need the truth. They need to understand. So our attitude and our gospel toward them has changed. We're not going to say, you sinner, you don't know God. No, that's not the case anymore. We are all created by God. We are children of God. And with this wisdom, we commune with them. Because when we do ceremonies here, when we invite the Lamido, he comes. His hands is representative even to Meganga, the Lamido comes. Even the Imam of the great mosque, we are together, we share. That's kind of it. Without touching on the problems there are between them and us. So we see that they have turned into some kind of politicians when it comes to inter-religious relationships. And we see very little of spiritual warfare, no power evangelism, etc. So, the same thing could be said about prosperity that I will not talk about here at all, but we can just say very briefly that Islam defines the economic context of this area. And then it's very hard to become a successful Christian businessman. So we can see that the context have driven the discourse of prosperity in other directions, towards education, for instance, and other stuff. Not so much about being a successful businessman. And then towards the end, what does the Muslim informants say about the Pentecostals? Well, we can say that they are reluctant but not hostile. A Muslim student said, well, since I do not wander much around in town, it is difficult for me to say to what extent these churches have been able to establish themselves here. What I do know is that they have many members who walk around from door to door in order to preach, give away flyers, and invite people to come to the meetings and other evangelization campaigns, which they often organize on certain street corners. Whereas the Wahhabi Imam has a slightly different approach. He says, seriously, do you know that these people make it impossible for hot water to sleep at night? Do you also know that the tom-tom disease, which our girls suffer from today, started with the arrival of these churches, especially with those who cry and shout as if the God they venerate was deaf? So you see there are some tensions here after all. The traditional Quran teacher, on the other hand, says, are you worried about the new churches? Not at all. Just that everyone has to teach his religion to his family. We have to apply what the Quran says. We have to initiate the children into the religious knowledge from the age of seven years. Apart from that, everyone can believe whatever they want. And the Christians can build as many chapels as they want. That is not going to remove Islam from our hearts. And finally, the Muslim students, who even admire them a bit. The only aspect I might admire among the Pentecostal is their solidarity. The spirit of sacrifice and denial, which they show in order to promote their teachings. Without this attitude, they would probably already have disappeared from town. Imagine if we, the Muslims, had been able to do the same. So a very strange and funny admiration from the Muslim sides of the Pentecostals. So towards the end, what are the concluding remarks? I found this picture here in a souvenir shop, explaining the challenges of the people in Cameroon. No to Boko Haram, no to corruption, no to malaria, and no to Ebola. So there it is. Well, Pentecostal flexibility and light-footedness includes migrants. It means that the Pentecostal churches, to a larger extent than the established churches, have been able to use their light-footedness, so to speak, to attract the migrants and the surplus of the people coming to town. It shows that Pentecostal dialogue with Islam is contextually informed. Because of the tension, they are very careful when they do mission among Muslims. This is both due to their historical roots and also because of the Boko Haram situation today. And of course, the prosperity teaching is modified by the context, and I'm working on an article also to see how this is being played out today. And finally, Christian-Muslim relations have survived Boko Haram, yes, but they are under pressure, and it will be interesting also to see in the future. But I think as long as also the Pentecostal churches will be able to maintain the peaceful approach towards Islam, there are good hopes for a continued peaceful relationship, at least in this area. Thank you very much.